Welcome to Swimming with Allocators,
the VC podcast from the LP perspective,
with your hosts, Alexa Benz
and Ernest Sweat. You ready? Let's dive in.
In advance to the 2024 election, we have a special guest today, Mr. Bradley Tusk. You may know Bradley from Tusk Venture Partners, where they invest in early stage startups in highly regulated industries. The first 15 years of his career were spent in government and politics, including managing Bloomberg's mayoral campaign. He speaks and writes in depth about the intersection of tech and politics. He also has a family foundation, which is leading a national campaign to bring mobile voting to all U.S. elections. Today, we're going to dig into the California AI bill and its potential implications on tech and VC, and the election and its impact on tech and regulation. So with that, thanks, Bradley, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So you've done a lot and two pretty competitive and quirky industries, to say the least.
Quirky is a nice way of putting it. But
yeah. I try to use nice terminology. I'm curious, how did you get to this point of launching a VC firm and a political advisory firm?
In 2009, I started my first company. It's a political consulting firm. And really early on in our existence, I get a call one day from a friend of mine saying, hey, there's a guy with a small transportation startup. He's having some regulatory problems. Would you mind talking to him? I become Uber's first political advisor that day. I get really lucky when Travis calls me back and says, listen, I can't afford your fee. Would you take equity? I had no idea what equity meant, but thank God I said yes. That was back during the Series A. Spent the better part of the next few years running campaigns all over the U.S. to legalize Uber and ride sharing. Did it again with Clear, taking equity to get them into airports. That worked too. And then met my partner, Jordan Knopf. Jordan at the time was running Blackstone's internal venture fund. And the question we started asking each other and ourselves is, if you really understand regulatory risk and you can do something about it, would that make you a better venture investor? And on the strength of that thesis, we went out and raised our first fund in 2016. And we're a lot like every early stage venture fund in that we're looking at the founder, the TAM, the underlying idea. But then we ask two questions that I think are somewhat unique to us. One, is there a gating regulatory issue or opportunity that if it were solved could really drive growth and valuation? And two, if so, can we solve it? And when the answer is yes to both, that's really when it makes sense for us to deploy capital. So the first deal we ever did was FanDuel, ran all the campaigns to legalize fantasy sports betting. Second deal we ever did was Lemonade, got them their insurance licenses in every state. Roman, legalized prescription via text, and so on. And we're now investing out of our third fund and raising our fourth.
I would be curious. So many VCs run away from regulatory areas. It's just the no-go zone. What do you wish more of them knew or understood?
Yeah, a few things. And I think to a certain extent, and we'll get into the election, I find some of the back and forth among some of the VCs in the Valley very silly about their supporting supporting Trump or Harris, simply because it just comes off to me like none of them really understand politics. The first thing is, despite everything we just said, you do sometimes need to know what you don't know. And oftentimes in our industry, meaning tech, there's an assumption that because you made $1 billion or because you went to Stanford or because you were in Y Combinator or you raised a lot of money, whatever it is, you're therefore a genius about everything, right? And, the world of creating a great tech company or raising a venture capital fund and deploying it well is very different than the world of passing legislation, blocking regulations, dealing with procurement. And they're just very different currencies, right? So I find that oftentimes, you'll get a founder or a VC that says, just put me in the room with the governor or whatever it is, and I'll get the sale done. And the problem is they don't even understand the underlying inputs. They just think that the brilliance of their argument is what matters. And what matters in, say, venture is how much money you raise, your ARR, what kind of product market fit you have. And we have KPIs that matter, but they're very different than the KPIs in politics, right? The KPIs in politics are polling, fundraising, media attention, ability to reach the narrow group of people who will actually vote in your next primary. And if you don't speak their language, it doesn't matter how smart you are. No one cares how much money you have or how much money you've raised or where you went to school. They just care about, can you either help me win the next election or not? And you have to understand that every decision in politics gets made solely based on whether they believe that you can either help them win their next election or by not cooperating with you, whether it could cost them their next election. If they believe either of those things, they'll work with you. And if they don't, everything else is irrelevant.
Yeah. I love the fact on just like how those are actually two different languages being spoken to each other, right?
Yeah,
Different
exactly.
insights.
Exactly.
And you all are serving as a bridge. I had a question about kind of these first couple of years doing it, or first couple of funds.
Yeah.
And, making your name in, whether it's transportation or with FanDuel and legal betting, right? Online betting. Those were traditional industries that already had a lot of regulation on them.
Yep.
Do you foresee more of those opportunities coming down the pike? And like if a investor is interested in one of those spaces, how do they even plan in thinking about how it impacts their possible thesis?
Yeah, a few things. So the first thing is, I would say that our work falls into one of two buckets. So the first one is what you described, which is a founder comes up with a better way to do something that already exists, right?
Yeah.
Travis did not invent the idea of paying someone to take you from point A to point B. He just came up with a much better way to do it, right? FanDuel did not invent gambling. They just came up with a better way to do it. So in those cases, the company comes along, they've got a better approach. They start taking market share away from the incumbents. The incumbents resort to politics to try to shut down the new competitor. And we have a big regulatory fight that's really about market share, but it's under the guise of regulation. The other bucket would be all the white spaces. So crypto, drones, AI, autonomous vehicles, whatever it is. And there's good and bad news there. The good news is there's not some big entrenched interest that we have to defeat. That makes life easier. The bad news is there are no rules at all. And it may sound great if you're Mark Andreessen and you believe in this tech utopia of full libertarianism. That may sound great on paper, but in reality, you can't build multi-billion-dollar industries and companies without some sense of structure, without some sense of rules and regulations. Human beings need that. I mean, if you think back to the very beginning of the human species, there were the Neanderthals who were not only bigger and stronger, they were smarter than the Homo sapiens too, but what they couldn't do was work together. And Homo sapiens, for whatever deficiencies we had, were able to form structure and rules in societies, and ultimately that won out. You need that today too. And so in that world, our work is less about fighting off the entrenched interest, and it's more around what should the regulatory framework be? Who should the regulator be? What should the rules be? What can we live with? What can't we live with? What might work really well with our particular technology. And so it fits into one or the other, but I would say, especially to understand your question on the first bucket, if you are an investor or a founder and you're sort of disrupting an existing industry, what you need to understand is who are you disrupting, how powerful are they, and can they stop you from operating, right? There are times where we don't make investments simply because while the idea might be cool and the founder might be smart, and there might be some things that we like about it, we think, you know what? This is not a winnable political fight, or at least not for a seed stage company that's going to have a couple $1 million in total to spend, let alone just for spending on a political campaign. And this doesn't really work. And then sometimes, people come in and they're all freaked out about what they think is going to be their big political challenge. I'm like, don't worry about it. It's going to be fine. Yeah. That state, that governor, or that legislature, they don't care about that thing at all, right? Because even within the world of powerful special interests, it's not universal, right? So a teachers union can be really powerful in one state, really weak in another. The NRA can be really powerful in one state and really weak in another. And an important thing to understand is the vast majority of tech regulation happens at the state and local level. Yeah. All of us in our head, when we think about government, the White House pops in or the Capitol pops in. And the reality is there are some tech areas where it's relevant, and we can talk about those. But the vast majority of it happens in either state houses or city halls, and that's who you both need to focus on and what you need to understand.
Bradley, it makes me think of one time a VC that was a little bit more tenured than I am brought up just the idea of Stripe and how he passed on it because he anticipated there was going to be more regulation. And then after kind of doing a postmortem, he was saying to himself, it wasn't as like headliney to fight against when you think about it, financial data shared so easily, you would think somebody would fight that, but it wasn't as like AI stealing this job or something like that. So even that mindset of thinking, okay, what will actually not only be a threat to people's constituencies, but also is palatable for somebody to actually eat and understand and build momentum on an argument.
Right. The narrative is critical, right? I remember passing on a deal, and maybe time will prove that right, maybe not. I'm still not sure yet. But I like the company. I kind of like the founder. I love the TAM. But I really felt like once what they were doing came to full light and the margin they were making on the backs of the taxpayers became something that reporters and legislators and others knew about, I didn't see how they would then survive the political fallout from that. And so I didn't make the investment. And that really was a narrative decision, right? It wasn't a legal decision. It wasn't based on the existing regulations. It wasn't even that there was a specific entrenched interest that I was worried about fighting. It was more, once all of this fully plays out, the narrative here to me is really problematic. And therefore that makes the risk greater than the
reward. One of these hot examples, I think, of where people maybe are confusing state level versus federal level is in AI regulation. Mm-hmm. Would you mind breaking down for us some of your perspective on what really matters there?
Yeah, a few things. So the first thing would be, I think, just because of the timing of us having this conversation, is the California bill that just passed, right? And so California passed a bill, for the listeners and viewers who aren't familiar with it, that it's the first comprehensive AI safety testing regulation in the country. And it's an interesting bill because it passed pretty overwhelmingly. I think it was something like 41-9 in the House and 32-1 with 7 abstentions in the Senate, something like that. It's on Gavin Newsom's desk right now. And for my read, it is really just very basic safety testing. It is not particularly onerous. It's not particularly expensive. And yet, all of the big AI companies, most of whom claim to be in favor of regulation, vociferously opposed it, right? So OpenAI, Anthropic, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Meta, everybody said, no, we can't possibly have it. And the reason I decided to be for the bill was I looked at their arguments against it and I said, these are all the same nonsense arguments that I make when I don't have a legitimate objection to something, but it's not good for me, right? So the first was like, oh, well, it'll just discourage innovation, right? And that's what you say when there's like nothing else there. It's if everyone's going to stop working on AI because now there's like some minor testing, or, oh, no one's going to do business in California. Oh, yeah, everyone's going to leave the most lucrative economy in the most lucrative country in the world because of some safety testing. Or, oh, they said, oh, this is just, a way to lock in the advantage of the big guys. You're hurting the little guy here. That's true. Why are all the big guys against it?
They're lobbying for it.
And all the industry associations against it. Like, clearly that's not true. And so I think Newsom both will sign it and should sign it. And politically speaking, because we were talking about earlier, Gavin Newsom's not thinking about this from the perspective one way of, is it better AI policy or worse? Gavin Newsom's thinking about, I, Gavin Newsom, want to be president really, really badly. And if Kamala loses, which he secretly hopes she does, I could run in 28. So what will best help me or hurt me? So on one hand, he's going to be tempted and say, well, these are some of the biggest companies in the world. I'm going to want their financial support, so I ought to do what they want. But here's the problem. If he vetoes the bill, he owns every problem associated with AI. When anything goes wrong anywhere and someone gets hurt or something fails or collapses or whatever it is, you would say, oh, well, if they'd had safety testing, that wouldn't have happened. Guess why they don't have it? Gavin Newsom. The legislature overwhelmingly supported it, but he was in the pocket of Anthropic, OpenAI, Meta, whoever it was, and therefore he's only out for the big guys against his actual constituents and against the voters. And I just think that would be so easy for someone like me in a campaign to just destroy him with, that I imagine, again, talking about the narrative of vetoing that bill is way too risky. But the other area that, at least, and this may get too wonky, so feel free to edit this out or whatever, but that I'm really interested in is, one, how government can use AI to better perform its own duties, and then two, worker classification regulation around AI. So I'll work backwards here. So I'm sure you guys remember all the big fights between, say, Uber and the unions, or DoorDash and the unions, where they would say, okay, are the drivers, are the delivery people employees, or are they independent contractors, right? The sharing economy platforms all said contractors, the unions all said employees, and it was simply because everyone had their own self-interest. If you were the platform, your costs were lower if they were contractors. If you were the unions, you could only organize these people and get their union dues and membership if they were employees. And so you had these big fights, and ultimately the biggest one was one called AB 5, also in California, that passed and then was overturned by a citizen referendum later that year. What I'm fascinated by is what happens when we're talking about functions where human beings are required to be licensed in some way, but it's now AI, not a human being, right? So for example, I haven't tried it, but I was reading an article that Equinox is rolling out these massage robots. So at least here in New York, massage therapists have to be licensed, right? And, either that's because there's some basic safety that they're worried about, or because the existing industry wants to sort of have protectionism and stop new competition. Either way, the licensing process exists. How do you license a massage robot? I don't know. What are you looking at the underlying LLM, right? So how we're going to issue professional licensure and determine worker classification for AI performing formerly human jobs, to me, is really fascinating. I think we'll create both moats and deficits for different AI companies, depending on where you're coming from and how you approach it. And I think it's going to create interesting alliances, right? When it was the pure, sharing economy stuff, it was just business versus labor, kind of the very classic dichotomy. And then here, you may have businesses that say, we're going to side with labor because even if we don't want our workers unionized, we certainly don't want them to be replaced by AI, assuming that they don't have the tech to do that, right? And they're going to want to block it. So you're going to see all kinds of weird bedfellows and alliances. So I think that's really fascinating. And then the other one would be the application of AI to government processes. So have either of you guys been in New York lately?
Yeah, like a month ago. Yeah.
Okay. Do you remember seeing illegal weed shops on every single corner?
I've heard everybody, and I was like, why are they here? And friends were like, they're just always coming up.
Yeah. So there's 140 licensed dispensaries across the state of New York and over 5,000 illegal dispensaries. And the reason this happened is in 2021, the New York State Legislature passed a law legalizing recreational cannabis. Fine, pretty normal.
Yeah.
It then took the agency 2.5 years to promulgate the rules and start issuing licenses. So what happened? In that void, New Yorkers knew, okay, weed's legal. You don't expect them to know what facility meets licensing requirements and which doesn't. And all these illegal facilities sort of they do whatever there's a void in the market or a vacuum in the market, which is it fills it, right? And they filled it with all these illegal dispensaries. But the problem is they were selling weed to anyone and everyone, right? So I have 2 teenage kids. I live in Manhattan. And, I suspect both of them have bought weed at illegal dispensaries, or at least, the risk is there, and their friends certainly have. And weed these days, I'm much older than you guys, but when I was a teenager, it was like a lot of stems and oregano, and it wasn't all that potent, right? But that shit is really potent. And I think and you could smoke a vape where there's no odor at all to it, or take a gummy or whatever it is. And you have kids. I was talking to the principal of my kid's school, and he's like, kids are high all the time. And so had you instead used AI to both develop the rules for who the licenses would be and then review the actual license applications itself, you could have resolved all that in months or even weeks, as opposed to 2.5 years. And instead of having a legal marketplace sprout up, you could have had the legal license system that we were supposed to have in the first place, and you would have protected an entire generation of teenagers. So I think that you can use AI to make government work better. And in general, procurement, rather than all of the politics and corruption that tends to revolve around decision-making about government contracts, you could have AI do it and sort of eliminate most of that risk.
Do you think that this vertical GovTech will have a moment more than it ever has over these next 10 years, or?
No, not necessarily. So we have 54 investments across the 3 funds so far. We have 2 GovTech deals in that. I love both of those companies. I'm on the boards of both of those companies, but I think that they are really exceptions to the rule. Overall, as someone who, when I was deputy governor in Illinois, one of the things that I oversaw was the state budget. So kind of procurement and all that reported up to me. And it's a horrible process, right? And to me, a business whose entire revenue stream is solely contingent on winning government RFPs is not a great business at all. I'm very happy when I have portfolio companies for whom it's a revenue stream. Great. And we can help you figure that out. And we can help you win that stuff. So we're not opposed to it, but when it's the entirety of your revenue stream, to me, you're really, really handcuffing yourself in many ways. And so if anything, the time when GovTech should be appealing to investors is when the economy is bad and you say, okay, this is sort of not even counter-cyclical, it's just not cyclical at all because the government always has to buy things, right?
Yeah.
And therefore you don't have to sort of worry about the normal ups and downs of the economy. But even in the pandemic and whatever else, I don't think we saw this giant boom with GovTech. There are specific things like, I think defense tech might be having a moment, especially as they get kind of more dual usage. And so that there's ways to sell the same type of product to make it useful for the federal government, but then also for state and local or utilities or consumers or whatever it is. So there might be some subsets within, we led the Series A called Odyssey, which is an ed tech company that runs school choice programs for states. So this is when a state says to parents, if you don't want to send your kid to the local public school and you want to do homeschool or parochial or private or whatever it is, we will provide you with funding to do that. Someone has to manage that whole program and run the marketplace between the parents and students and the state and the educational providers. Odyssey does that. That is a significantly growing market. So that's why we led their Series A. So there are some exceptions. IndieGov is another company that we led their Series A and I'm on the board of, where we do, it's a constituent, it's like a CRM for government. So effectively, it allows government to much better manage their interactions with constituents, log complaints, find problems, follow up. And ultimately, the reason why that's really good is if you're a politician and the constituents think that you're on top of things, it makes you look good and they like to look good. So to me, that was an exception. So there are a handful, but overall, are we super bullish on GovTech now?
Okay. The reason I asked that is that I was trying to think of why our industry has been so vocal about their allegiances in this upcoming election. And so my mind first comes to, okay, where's the advantage and opportunity?
So why do you think about that? Yeah, I just don't think it's necessarily good. So there's some, if you're a big investor like Anduril, for example, or they've got big defense contracts, or SpaceX obviously has big, NASA contracts or things, Starlink, things like that. So there are some, and there's for someone like Elon Musk, look, I'm supporting Harris. I've signed that VC pledge for Harris. I've donated 6 figures. I strongly think she's the better option than Trump. But I understand why some people might think that their portfolio or their companies would be better suited in a Republican White House than a Democratic White House. So I think here are those areas. One is crypto. So Gary Gensler, who's the head of the SEC for Biden, is the most anti-crypto regulator in history. And I think what makes Gensler so particularly awful is it's not just that he's anti-crypto. He won't tell people what the rules are, right? So to say to them, we'll just do what you're going to do and we'll see. And maybe we'll indict you and maybe we won't, but we're not going to give you any rules to live by. That's not it. That's bullshit, right? That's not democracy. That's not the rule of law. So look, I don't see
So people are popping up their illegal wheat stores. That's the equivalent.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Totally. And by the way, we were investors in Coinbase, we're investors in Circle. If you are a legitimate player in that industry, you want some rules, right? Because you don't want to be competing against fraudulent ICOs because that undermines consumer confidence in the whole sector. But you want to know what the rules are, right? Maybe you can lend on margin, maybe you can't. We can have a reasonable discussion as to whether or not that's good public policy, but you can't just refuse to tell anybody, right? And so we know for a fact that whoever runs Trump's SEC will probably be vastly better at crypto. And so I think that's why you have some, especially like Andreessen Horowitz, and they have so much exposure to that sector. The good news is I don't see Harris reappointing Gensler either. And so I think we'll get a better SEC chair no matter what. The FTC would be the next one. So that's Federal Trade Commission. Lena Khan is the chair of the FTC. And she's really interesting because I would say some of her work has been very pro-innovation and some has been very anti-innovation. innovation. So the pro innovation, at least from my perspective, would be her efforts to break up really big tech. So as an early stage investor, I can't invest in a company that wants to challenge Apple or Microsoft or Meta or Amazon or whatever, because they're giant monopolies with monopolistic power and there's no way to compete with them. And so that discourages early stage investment in innovation. So I think her efforts around that are actually laudable. However, her general view that all tech is bad and all business is bad and all M&A is bad is a huge problem, because it's had this massive chilling effect that has just led to so much less activity. And as you guys know, it's awesome when a portfolio company of yours IPOs, but that's like 10, 15% of your portfolio, right? Of those where there are exits, and the rest are M&A deals. And when M&A deals are totally shut down because everyone is terrified that the Feds will just block whatever they're trying to do, that's a huge chilling effect. And what does that lead to? It leads to less venture investment, less new company formation, less graduation to successive rounds, less innovation, less jobs, less technology. And so the good news, again, I think, will be Lina Khan, I would imagine, won't be there in the new administration, whether it's Harris or Trump. But again, you could say, I want someone who is totally pro M&A, and that's why you might be supportive of Trump. So, there are some public policies where people might say that they believe that Trump would be better for them than Harris. But again, as we discussed earlier, it's not really where most tech regulation happens in the first place. The vast majority of it is happening at the state level, at the local level. So who's governor, who's mayor, who's the speaker of the state assembly, the Senate president, that stuff matters a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
I also can't help but feel like it's a bit naive to say, I support X candidate being Trump because Trump also believes in XYZ, when we've seen he can flip-flop on things pretty quickly.
Trump believes in Trump. Trump believes in his own ambition and nothing else. For example, TikTok is a good tech example, right? When Trump was president, he was absolutely right, in my view, to say that TikTok has to divest to a sale of a U.S. owner. But then, when that law actually passed with broad bipartisan support, by the way, both parties, he had donors who didn't like that position because they had a huge stake in ByteDance, and all of a sudden he flipped, and now he's against, the requirement. So, yeah, relying on Donald Trump to be consistent on anything is a very dangerous thing to do.
Yeah, he's absolutely. And I am curious too, if you're focused on specifically crypto, or you're focused on, is this going to be good for my companies exiting? Are you sort of missing the forest for the trees?
Totally.
That, what economy, what does a better American economy, what kind of policies do we need in place for not just 4 years, 8 years, 20 years?
Sure. Let me give you a perfect example, which would be Jerome Powell and the independence of the Fed, right? One of the real benchmarks of our economy is that we have an independent Federal Reserve that makes decisions on interest rates that are based on their view on how to combat inflation or deal with unemployment, but not how to elect or unelect any particular politician, right? And Jerome Powell has been very, very independent. And I think most presidents that have worked with him are unhappy, right? I think Joe Biden, Donald Trump, I think a lot of them are not necessarily happy about it. But I respect that, right? It doesn't mean that I necessarily agree with every decision the Fed makes, but I respect the fact that they're making it for the right reasons. And Trump has been very explicit that he would like to eliminate the independence of the Fed. I think the long-term damage that would do to our economy is significantly greater than any upside you get in your portfolio because you have a better regulator on crypto or M&A or whatever it might be.
Yeah. If you're investing in businesses that are going to be private for the next 12 years, what is this time horizon that you're thinking about? Right.
And the other thing is, look, I don't know if this is true for you guys, but it is for me, which is we're venture capitalists, yes, but we're also human beings living in the world, right? Yes. And I found it really stressful when Trump was president. Just the level of chaos, the level of vitriol, the level of conflict, the level of uncertainty. Like, I didn't like living like that, and I think Joe Biden was like the best in every way. No, but he was like at least a sort of more normal person. And I kind of appreciated that about him. And so I just personally forget about my portfolio or whatever else. Like, I just don't want to live like that.
Yeah. It was like the last season of Veep. It's like, I don't want that. That's funny to laugh at, but I don't want that to be my reality.
Correct.
I think Kenneth
yeah.
Chenault likened it to like Russian roulette, where it's like you didn't get shot in the head last time, but you're still playing.
That's a great analogy. Yeah,
That's amazing. When we met in person, Bradley, we spoke a little bit about this idea of mobile voting,
Yeah.
and you actually have a book
I do.
coming out, Vote with Your Phone, which really pushes kind of the importance of mobile voting and how it can really influence and engage more voters, not just for presidential, but all elections.
Yep.
Can you just briefly kind of share
Yeah,
how you
sure.
got this
Thank
interest
you
and
for giving
what
me
you
the
think?
chance to
Yeah.
talk about it. Yeah, this is my passion. So stop me when I'm going on too long. But,
Okay.
So as you guys mentioned, I spent the first 15 years of my career working directly in government and politics, and I feel like I've really seen it from every angle. I've worked in city government, state government, federal government, executive branch, legislative branch, Philly, New York, DC, Chicago, and I took one thing away from it, which is every policy output is the result of a political input. Every politician makes every decision solely based on the next election and nothing else. And are there a handful of exceptions? Sure. Mike Bloomberg was one that I happen to work for, but it's a handful, right? And because of gerrymandering, which is the process by which legislative districts are sort of pre-drawn to determine that the seat's going to be consistently Democrat or consistently Republican, the only election that really ever matters is the primary. And primary turnout is typically 10 to 15%. So who is that? It's the furthest left, it's the furthest right, or it's big special interests. And so if you are a politician and your only goal is to stay in office, not only are you chosen by the extremes, but then all of your policies and all of your decisions are dictated by the extremes. So we get one of two things. Either we get the absolute chaos of Washington, D.C., where it's total dysfunction, total polarization, everybody fighting, nothing getting done, or we get totally one-sided government, and whether that's the state of Texas on the right or the city of San Francisco on the left, in my view, it's both a problem, right? Which is, we want moderation, we want compromise, we want consensus, we want the views of the mainstream to become our laws and policies. And until turnout becomes significantly higher in primaries, we're never going to get that. So let me give you a couple examples. When Amazon wanted to put their second headquarters here in New York City in Queens, the city as a whole very much supported it. The district as a whole very much supported it. But AOC came out against it. And Mike Gerdes, who's the state senator for Long Island City, said, oh no, my primary typically has around 10% turnout. Those are very left-wing voters. And if I support this deal, even though most people in my district want it, those people don't vote in my primary. AOC's followers do. I'm going to lose my next primary. And so Mike had a choice. 40,000 new jobs for New Yorkers or one job, his own. And guess which one he picked? He picked himself, right? Or, imagine that you are a Republican congressman from Florida and turnout in your primary is 12%. District is gerrymandered, so only the primary matters, and NRA members are half of that 12%. You may know intellectually that it's nuts that someone can walk into a store and walk out with an AK-47, but you also know that if you were to say that, let alone vote that way, you would be thrown out of your job in the next election. And so therefore we have school shootings, and we have church shootings, and we have Walmart shootings because people put their own political survival well ahead of the safety of kids or other people. We had one in Georgia just last week. And so, but now envision a world where in those same primaries, turnout instead of being 12% or 10% were 30%, 36%. Just based on math, all of a sudden Mike Gerdes would have been for the Amazon deal. The Republican congressman would have been for some sort of sensible gun laws, not because they became better people. They're who they are. They're just politicians. But because now the underlying inputs changed. And in order for them to stay in office, they need to be pro-jobs, pro-sensible gun laws, right? And when I ran those Uber campaigns around the country, the way that we want to beat the taxi industry is that we were able to get millions of our customers from all over the place to tell their elected officials, hey, leave this thing alone. I want it. And even at the time, we were a tiny little tech startup and taxi was a big muscular industry. We want absolutely everywhere because we changed the inputs, right? You're a city councilman in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the taxi guys give you a couple of grand for your election every couple of years. You do what they want. I just had 5,000 of your constituents call, email, text, tweet, tell you, hey, I like this thing, don't touch it. And guess what you say? Okay. I'm not going to risk pissing off all of these voters. Sorry, taxi industry, I'm going this way. And when that was happening, I started wondering, these people who are advocating for us, as much as I love them, they don't know who their city councilman is. They don't know who their state senator is. They're not voting in local primaries, but maybe they would if we made it as easy as we're making it to advocate for Uber. And so that's how the idea for mobile voting came about. And I kind of created the Mobile Voting Project. And in 2018, we sponsored the first election in U.S. history where deployed military from West Virginia were able to vote in elections on their phones. Because imagine if you're a member of our military, you are literally risking your life to protect our right to vote, a right most of us don't even bother to use. And then you're in Kandahar and you mail in your ballot and it shows 3 weeks after the election, and guess where it goes? Into the trash, right? And you're totally disenfranchised. So Mac Warner, who was a very conservative Republican, but Mac had been in the military and all 4 of his kids were in the military. And Mac felt like it is really unfair that we make it so hard for people who are deployed and serving our country to vote. And so he approved mobile voting. And then we ended up doing 7 different states where either deployed military or people with disabilities voted in real elections on their phones. But I got a lot of pushback from the cryptography community that the voting tech that was out there was not sufficiently secure. So I decided, you know what? I'm going to build my own mobile voting tech. So 4 years later, we are just about done. We're working off of the recommendations from the Future of Voting report from the U.S. Vote Foundation. The tech we are building is end-to-end encrypted, end-to-end verifiable, air-gapped, multi-factor authentication, biometric screening, and most importantly, it's open source, which means that anyone can see what happened and audit the code and see if anything went right or anything went wrong or anything else. And you can check the work every single time. And when we are fully done and we have submitted it to entities like NIST for their review, I'm going to make it free and open source so any government can use it for free. This has all been done by my foundation. I've spent about $20 million of my own money so far on mobile voting. And the reason that I wrote this book is the next step, which is to legalize this everywhere, right? Because as much as politicians might be frustrated that they're sort of held hostage by the extremes, they also know how to win in the current system, right? And if you said to them, hey, guess what? We're going to triple turnout, and maybe you'll hold your seat, maybe you won't. They're like, no. I don't do that. And so they're all going to ironically unite against us, Democrats, Republicans, unions, lobbyists, trade groups. And the only way we're going to overcome all of that is to build a movement, right? And we're going to need Gen Z and Gen Alpha and people in every different community. We've built a coalition of civil rights leaders. In fact, I'm doing an event with Martin Luther King III at the Carter Presidential Library in a couple of weeks on this, and disability leaders and military leaders and different groups to say, no, we deserve the right to vote securely on our phones. And that's what I'm trying to do. And, I wrote the book to just try to help build this movement and get people interested. And so if you like what you just heard for the last couple of minutes of my rant, if you go to votewithyourphone.org, you can learn more and get involved. And, we'd love your help.
And so cool that this passion came out of seeing what you could build inside the Uber app to motivate customers to become
and Travis, to his credit, because he gets a lot of shit from a lot of people. If mobile voting happens, one of the people, and if it does change turnout in a way that forces everyone towards the middle and lets us get things done, one of the people who really deserves credit for that is Travis Kalanick.
Yeah, I don't feel like, unless you're paying attention, you're a sort of politically minded person, you don't even know when the primaries are happening.
Correct, right. But imagine now if Meta and TikTok and whatever platforms exist and iOS and Google and Android are all just bugging you, be like, did you vote? Did you vote? Did you vote? All you gotta do is download this app and you can vote. And you're waiting for your coffee or where you're sitting there in traffic or whatever it is. And you go boom, boom, boom. You press a few buttons. All of a sudden now you participated. And guess what? The elections that have the lowest turnout are the ones that impact you the most. It's, mayoral, city council. So here in New York City, primary turnout last year for the council was 7.2%. You could win a city council seat with 6,000 votes in a city of 8.5 million people. And that results in really terrible governance because those are just the extremes, and the city council is governing just to cater to a handful of extremes. We need people to work together to get things done, and this prevents that, the current system.
Well, you're putting your money. You're putting your money to go to work. You're putting your money into the things you care about.
I'm definitely trying. Yeah,
thank you, Bradley.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, Bradley. Thanks for just all the insights. And I think as this comes out, as people get geared up to vote their paper ballots, they'll think, oh, we should actually just be doing this on our phone. So thanks so much.
Exactly. Well, thank you guys both for having me. This is how we win this fight. So I'm really grateful to both of you. And when you guys are back in New York, let me know. We'd love to grab a coffee or something.
Absolutely. Take care.
Cool.
See you later, allocator.
After Portfolio Tile, investing with a smile.